Us here today. We are very lucky to have Rami Hindieh as our speaker for this very interesting topic, which, to be honest, I myself was very puzzled when I first saw the title. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot today. Um, just a little bit about the Blockchain Hub. It's an organization that is associated with the York University that focuses on education in blockchain, getting you job ready for blockchain, and also working with industry as well as academia in deepening the technology application across various industries. So we regularly have these webinars where we try to touch on different topics. We've had ones in the past on Libra, on supply chain and healthcare, and I'm very happy today to be welcoming Rami to this new webinar session on aviation. Rami has worked in a few industries, aviation, insurance, and banking, and he's passionate about anything technology. And what he does is he helps organizations in digital transformation by introducing these new technologies. So without any further ado, I will let Rami further introduce himself and dive right into the topic of blockchain in aviation. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And maybe on the everyone's on mute, by the way, so I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I can see your screen now, Rami. You can go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. So without further ado, let's just get started. So the objective of this presentation was we were looking for opportunities to leverage innovative, latest generation technologies like blockchain. And guess what? In an industry like aviation, who would have thought, right? To basically improve those passenger experiences and look for means to add additional revenue to the airports. So I'm sure that's going to raise a lot of questions to many people as to how on earth are they going to do that? What are the various applications of blockchain? And the purpose of this presentation is to kind of give you a taste of some of the opportunities with the blockchain in that regard. So let me see if I can move. One of the primary questions that is not just unique to aviation, but I would say almost every single industry that is customer focused, is understanding the nature of your customer, and in our case, the passenger. And oftentimes when you look at people in an airport, some of the things that you notice is that they tend to be nervous, they tend to be excited, they can be at times overwhelmed with the lines and queues and with the sheer sizes of terminals and what have you. And as such, this is where information can play such a critical role to help address some of these pain points. So then let's ask a question. Who are our passengers today? Well, we know for one that they are digitally savvy passengers. I mean, almost everybody today carries a smartphone. And with a smartphone, you get instant access to information in your fingertips. Information that is readily available, information that can help improve your experience. But ultimately, for that to happen, this information needs to be individualized to your specific needs. It needs to be trusted. It needs to be certifiable. And that's the trick. There's a lot of information out there. How do you tailor the information in such a manner that is specific to the individual needs of that passenger? So airports have invested significantly in a lot of areas to help enhance the seamless passenger flow. Now, I'm sure a lot of you who recently traveled, maybe about 6 months ago, who knows, with this COVID, may have noticed that when you walk into a terminal space, you really don't interact with a lot of people in a lot of traditionally frontline jobs, right? Like, for example, your check-in counter. There's a kiosk now where you can basically print your boarding pass, or you can even have it on your phone when you drop off your baggage. Again, it's an area where you basically print your own sticker, you stick it on the bag, and off it goes without even having to deal with any individual. So that's the whole notion and idea of seamless travel, is to self-empower passengers to essentially take control of their journey without having to rely on any personnel on the ground. But there's one area in the airport that I would say is rather dated in the sense that there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation in that area. And that is on the arrival side. When you're waiting to pick up your bags, I'm not too sure about you, but based on the statistics and the surveys that have been conducted by so many aviation bodies, including IATA, one of the biggest contention points in aviation in terms of the passenger experience is always on the arrival side. You notice that people, after a long, exhausting journey, they arrive and yet they have to wait for their bag. And sometimes that wait could be 5 minutes if you're lucky. And oftentimes it could be 45 minutes or even longer. And with every bag that shoots out, you're wondering, is that my bag? Is my bag going to be the next one? And so on and so forth. And it's by far probably the most frustrating 45 minutes that you'll encounter in the entire journey, keeping in mind that you're exhausted from that. So we look to that as an opportunity. How could we turn around that experience in a manner that could improve passenger experience, and at the same time, while they're waiting for their bags, because there are some things that you can control and some things that you can't control in terms of the time that you wait for a bag to show up. How could you monetize that time, translate that into revenue dollars? Well, let's try to connect the dots collectively here. Well, for one, when you look at the passenger experience, if you are informed well ahead of time as to when you anticipate your bag to come, that actually frees you up. You don't have to push and shovel your way onto the carousel and wait for your bag to show up. You know when and where your bag's going to be through the whole digitization evolution. And if we could give you a 5 to 10 minute heads up that your bag is going to make its way to you, I think that's ample time for you to essentially do what you have to do with your free time elsewhere. But then the next question is, what do you do with all that free time? Potentially, especially if, say, for example, your bag is 45 minutes out and there's no sign of it coming anytime soon, and you haven't received that alert. Well, in some airports in Europe, like, say, London Heathrow, I don't know if many of you have noticed this, but when you're coming in on the arrivals, you will notice that there's actually a duty-free on the arrival side, similar to the duty-free that you experience when you're actually departing the country. Now, we don't have that in Canada, but if we were to mimic that same model that you see in Heathrow to the one in Canada, then I think there's a possibility that rather than just hang out endlessly in the arrivals carousel baggage hall, you could probably go and spend some time shopping, knowing very well that the minute you pass those gates, you're going to probably pay a premium on the taxes. So that's an opportunity right there. Simple solutions, there's no rocket science around it, but it's just a matter of how to utilize that idle time in a manner that could potentially turn things around and help win-win situation for both the airport as well as for the passenger. So, like anything, before we could even talk about the whole notion of blockchain, we got to get our foundations in order. And one of the things that I discovered when I was working at the airport was that there was a lot of data. It was all over the place. The real question was, how do you actually leverage data as a strategic asset in a manner that is truly usable in its true sense and form? Well, for one, we decided that we needed to build a central warehouse to kind of bring it all in. But at a high level, that's the easy part. One of the things that you notice when you're actually bringing all this data that traditionally has sat in disparate areas all across the business is that the representation and interpretation of this data is inconsistent all across the board. And when you're trying to stitch it together in a relational model, that's where it falls apart. And so we went through, I would say, a considerably lengthy exercise, just going through each and every single one of these data elements, just to standardize it and build a solid foundation for data sharing. Because blockchain is really all about data sharing. But if you don't have quality data to share in the first place, you're not going to really have a lot of fruitful results from this endeavor. So let's talk a bit about the baggage journey. When you look at the baggage journey, there are so many opportunities to collect data. It could start as early as the comfort of your home, where you're booking your plane ticket. And with a lot of the pricing models in place today, you actually get to pick and choose if you want to check in the bag, and you pay for that with some airlines. Now, with the wealth of that information that is made available to the airport weeks or months in advance, airports are able to anticipate the volume of bags that are going to make its way to them and essentially adjust their resourcing plans accordingly. Now, this doesn't apply to a lot of flights because some international flights, you get the standard 1 or 2 check-in bags. But some others, especially the charter ones, this is something where you have to pay. It's treated as a premium, right, to check in your bag. So again, some opportunities there. But the whole notion of a bag starts from the moment you drop in your bag at the point of induction to the point of screening, sorting, and then when it gets loaded into the aircraft. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out to you. At every junction that you see, the screening, the sorting, and the loading into the aircraft, there's actually different organizations that are handling this piece. So in Canada, the screening piece is handled by CATSA. The sorting could be by whoever runs the baggage system within the airport. And then whoever loads into the airport, into the aircraft, essentially would be the contractor that the airline deals with from its baggage handling piece. So there are varying different parties involved. And as the bag moves through each and every single one of these, there are all these sensors that you will see surrounding the bag in order to read the bag tag. And what happens is, as the bag moves along, they capture an instance of what this bag is, where it's going, and they essentially adjust its path to reflect where it should be heading to and which gate and what have you. Now, that's a lot of information that's coming your way. And this is infrastructure that exists today. So we don't have to actually invest any additional money to basically make this happen. We already have this infrastructure. It's just a matter of how do you repurpose a lot of this information that you have in a manner that is far more useful. And this is where blockchain plays such a critical role. You see, as an airport operator, you depend on so many players to basically have a smooth running operation. Let's give you some stats as an example. Like at Toronto Pearson Airport, the operator employs about 1,500 people. The airport on the whole employs almost 45,000 people. That sheer number, variable and variation, just tells you that the operator just plays a small role in the running of the airport and depends heavily on all of these different parties for the successful running and smooth operation of an airport. But there's a problem with that. When you look at each of these organizations, they manage data in their own unique ways. And when they share information to the operator, oftentimes this information is not readily available. The quality of the information could be questionable. And at times it could actually lead to disputes because of costs that are incurred as a result of events that are captured. I'll give you an example. We have image-based sensors that actually capture the moment a plane pulls in to the minute essentially the passengers are offloaded, the baggage is offloaded, the fuel truck comes in, the catering truck, et cetera, et cetera. And each of these events are captured by video. Now, in the old days, you basically had to rely on the data that was inputted by each of these different players. And if any of these were late, they would have to pay a penalty of some sort, or the airline ultimately would have to pay a penalty. And as such, there's a cost involved in this. So oftentimes people would try to, let's just say, submit information that wasn't exactly reliable. So this is one way to digitize that and essentially transform a very operational event-based organization into one that's very digital in that manner. But blockchain can really serve a huge purpose and objective here. You see, when you think about blockchain, the return on investment with blockchain is such that as you add more and more and more participants to the chain, you get a huge value from it. If it's just 1 or 2 players, there's so many other solutions that could work. But in a very dynamic environment like an airport, where there are so many hands involved and operators and what have you, this is a really optimal solution to help this. When we decided to launch this pilot, we had to think about a very, I would say, easy kind of low-hanging fruit just to kind of get us off the ground, because there were so many different applications of blockchain. And the baggage journey was just one of the easiest ones to think about. The objective of the pilot was really simple. What we wanted to do was to capture the journey of your bag in a manner very similar to how you would capture the journey of a parcel that you would send off in FedEx or DHL or what have you. You know where it's in, when it's in a distribution center, when it's in transit, et cetera, et cetera. Well, why not do the same thing with capturing your bag and the journey associated with that? But there's a problem for an airport. And the problem is this. The passengers that navigate through the airport are not the customers of the airport. And most airports, with the exception of Singapore's Changi Airport, don't have a loyalty-based program where they could capture your information, individualize a custom offering that's tailored to your personal needs. So we're working with a bit of a blind spot here in terms of the navigation of passengers. But we also know that there's ways around that. When you basically induct your bag into the self-baggage drop-off point, you get a unique identifier. And that unique identifier does not represent any personal identifiable information. It's just a random number. But if you capture that on your app, and you're able to essentially trace the journey of that number that is associated with your bag throughout the journey, and each of these different induction points, whether it's the sortation, the screening, the loading into the aircraft, you know that your bag is going to be in that aircraft, and you know where it is at any point in time in the journey. Same thing on the arrival side. When the bag is offloaded from the plane, it has to be screened. And the baggage handler who basically scans the bag will basically offer you an opportunity of 5 to 10 minutes from the point it's basically scanned to the point that it basically shoots out into the carousel. And that is the point of time differential that we want to leverage to offer you an opportunity to give you a heads up that, hey, your bag is on its way, you have 5 to 10 minutes to come and grab it. So rather than wait for 45 minutes, you're given basically an opportunity to prepare and go to the carousel where your bag is going to be presenting itself within a 5 to 10 minute heads up. And that's the idea behind freeing up your time to do something else. Then comes the point where, how do you basically have duty-free in Canada? Well, again, this is where technology leads to evolution, and evolution can sometimes lead to a change in legislation. So one of the things that started happening was there was a conversation with the government around perhaps changing our attitudes towards duty-free so that we don't just see it on the way out, but perhaps we could also mimic London Heathrow's airport on the way in as well. So a tremendous opportunity there to monetize the solution. Let's talk a bit about the blockchain solution itself. So a bit of a solution overview of what was put together. And again, this was all a pilot, so I just want everyone to keep that in mind. You have the various players involved in the network. So that includes the passengers, the airlines, the baggage handlers, and the airports. There are a series of different dashboards, each catered and tailored to a specific purpose. If you're a passenger, you want to see your baggage journey. If you're an airline, you want to make sure that that bag is tracked and loaded so that you don't have to pay fees if that bag is late for whatever reason. If you're a baggage handling company, it just makes it easier to basically account for your bags. And as an airport, there's that whole reputational awareness of making sure that the bags that are basically loaded into planes from your airport meet the 100% criteria, or at least close to that number in terms of meeting the mark. And this way, people would want to travel through your airport if you have a choice, and if people basically are transiting or going through other regional airports within the vicinity. Then we have a server API, which essentially captures all this information and essentially goes through a web interface to all the different nodes. So you have a principal node, an airport node, an airline node, and then the baggage handlers node. And that's where we start getting into that whole blockchain space. The MariaDB was nothing more than just a means of providing security in terms of access for the information. So just to kind of recap on that, so for the specific intent of the pilot, the front end was built using a React.js, HTML, CSS. The server-side application was made with the Node.js. All front-end communications were done with the REST API calls. And we used a Quorum blockchain network for the purposes of information sharing. And as I mentioned earlier, the MariaDB was used for login passwords for the chain data. Let's talk a bit about the blockchain network itself. So if you recollect, in the previous diagram, we had all the different players and the visualizations in terms of the dashboards and how you brought it all together over HTML. But now you have all these nodes, and you're essentially now building the blocks. And with every block, you have the ledger data, which includes the passenger data, the luggage data, transaction history data, etc. And then there are the smart contracts. So when you think of the check-in luggage, right, the point it was created, was there any modifications? Was it canceled? Was there any confirmations? Anything of that nature that could happen with your bag. Route management, is this a direct flight? Is it going through transits? How many hops is it going through? Again, things like that we'd be very much interested in capturing. Luggage status, is it late? Is it delayed? Is it associated with a flight that is in a problem, et cetera, et cetera. A passenger notification, so this is essentially the one that alerts the passenger through that passenger dashboard. And then event generation, that's more for the airports. Now, when you look at this network, one of the things that you have to look at is you need an administrator like any blockchain network. And this is where the principal node plays that role. And as an airport, essentially, we put in the big money to basically build this infrastructure and become the administrators. I would say it wasn't the most ideal state. And the reason being is this. As you start getting more and more people onboarded with the blockchain solution, you start running into very strategic and challenging questions, like the synergy of architectures that are starting to all come together. The data sharing between all these different airports. If there's any competition between regional airports, how do you manage that? If there were opportunities to monetize this solution, again, how would you manage that, keeping in mind that you have a competitive edge as an administrator? And this is where I always like or have a preference to have a third party like the government administer the blockchain network on behalf of the airports. Ideally, Transport Canada would be a great candidate for that, and they would be impartial to how information is traded and exchanged between all of these varying parties. Even better is if we are to, besides having the administration of the blockchain network done by a third-party government agency, have your information relayed through the airlines themselves. Because when you think about it, if you're going to download the app for every single airport that you travel from, it's not the most practical experience. You can travel through many airports, but traditionally you probably deal with one or two airlines because of your loyalty program. So ideally, if we were to integrate into the airline app, what we have built as a trial, and essentially connect that to your personal information, and then essentially now this is a contract between you and the airline, and all what we've done is we've extended the capabilities to track your bag. I think that would be a huge win for the industry. Those are future considerations. This was a pilot, so many opportunities to consider in the future. And I think that's about it for this presentation. So with that, I leave it to some questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Rami. That was fascinating. I never really would have thought of that in a million years. This is really interesting. Well, you know what? Since I'll start off with my question, and then we'll get everybody else's question here. But Rami, I'm really interested to know what inspired you to think about blockchain in the first place.
That's a good question. I was sitting in London Heathrow waiting for my flight. I was in the lounge actually, and I was looking at the dashboard in the lounges that tell you if your flight's on time, if it's late, and it was showing me that the flight was on time. But then I was getting an alert from the airline through their app that the flight was going to be late. And if you fly Air Canada and you're in London Heathrow, you'll know that Air Canada actually is a bit of a distance in terms of where they host where the airplane parks relative to the main terminal. It's almost like a 10-minute walk. So time is really precious in terms of just managing your expectations. So I was getting all this mixed information. And as a passenger, I was asking myself, there's got to be a better way to kind of get the left hand to talk to the right hand and just be consistent in terms of what information is coming your way, especially in a very schedule-driven environment where time is everything. And you got to get it right or else you're going to miss your flight and your experience is just going to go down. So this is where I started thinking about different applications of technology where you get all these different players that may not necessarily talk to each other directly in the traditional sense to work through technology. And a medium like blockchain would really help advocate for that. So it was really that simple. It was just sitting in a cafeteria in the lounge and going through that experience and just found
light bulb went off. Yeah. It's really when you experience a problem, right, that you try to think of the solution. I think that's how a lot of light bulb moments have come off. Okay, so I see a bunch of questions here. We'll probably have a chance to get through all of them, but since you were already on that point, one person asked, what is the hold on a second. Where's that question now? But the question was around why use blockchain and not a traditional database? Oh yeah, I see that question here. I'm still confused about why the blockchain is used instead of a traditional database. Any ideas on that one?
I think when you think of a traditional database, it's great, but the environment that basically houses this information is very limited. And when you think of blockchain, you have open blockchains like public, you have private blockchains. And one of the things I mentioned earlier was that your return on investment in blockchain increases exponentially as you add more and more and more players. A database is great within one organization. But when you think of aviation and the whole geopolitical nature of aviation where you're crossing borders and different countries and jurisdictions, I don't think a database is going to cut it as well. And this is why blockchain offers something that really remedies around that solution. But it's a good question.
Yeah, and it's a question that comes up in different areas I found. So it's worth asking. Okay, next question. What was the reason to select Quorum blockchain framework rather than another one?
At the time, it was the most popular one for a really simple reason. I think one of the big banks, I believe it was Citibank, if I'm not mistaken, was a huge advocate of it. And it was really just a pilot. So we didn't really have a really big preference. We just went with something that there was advocacy for and where we saw an opportunity. And I think it also had a pseudo-private public kind of mix where you could actually tap into that. But again, it was a pilot and the idea behind it was more to just test the whole philosophy around blockchain and to see if we can get that off the ground.
Okay. Another question, how did you get the government to change legislation?
Oh, we didn't. We're still working on it.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well. Yeah.
Weird. Yeah, I'd be very lucky if I was able to get that sorted out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, if anybody on the call can help him out there, I'm sure he'd appreciate it. Get him connected. Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have here? I think you can see the chat as well. So if I miss any questions that you want to answer, please let me know.
Let me take a look.
Somebody's looking to understand better what you mean by better return on investment by using blockchain. Not sure what the context is.
You're no, I think that's a fair question. With any project, you get asked the traditional question. I mean, what am I getting in return for this? You have to justify the costs. Now, the thing with blockchain is that you're not really investing a significant amount of money in overhauling the whole infrastructure. You're really just building out one component for information sharing. Everything else, as I mentioned earlier, is already there. It's all there for grabs. So the idea is really, how can you utilize all this information that exists, that was built for really specific purposes and objectives to serve at that point in time when they basically put that infrastructure, to bring it all together and build a bigger story around that. And that's where I talk about that return on investment. The return on investment can be qualified in many ways. It can be qualified in that passenger experience, where you get awards like the ACI award. It could be qualified in how many of these passengers, especially the ones that transit through your airport. I think in Toronto Pearson, about, if I'm not mistaken, 45% are transit passengers. So if you have a bad experience in an airport, you will have choices, and you will probably avoid an airport where your bags are always missed for whatever reason. So it's always good for business to keep passengers coming and traveling through you. And then there's that whole opportunity to monetize the solution, right? As I mentioned earlier. So again, those are the means of taking a solution and then converting that into an experience and dollars in that essence.
Okay, thank you. So I see some questions here about whether the aviation industry is still a good industry to get into this now. Yeah, probably not the best timing. I think we all.
When this was done last year. As you all may know, aviation took a really big hit this year, so a lot of this stuff is on hold. One of the things that you all have to realize is you have to, for technology and these kind of projects to work, you have to have a real problem you're trying to fix. At the moment, there's not much of a problem because there's not much traffic going, right? So in terms of capacity and in terms of the available resources to handle whatever goes through, I mean, I think there's an abundance of that at the moment. But this was really a reflection of 2019 in terms of a challenge that many airports were dealing with. The constraints, the capacity, the whole notion of talking about sweating resources. So it's a very different time period from then and now.
Absolutely. Okay, question just came out. How would a third party go about pitching blockchain solutions in the aviation for, I guess, the airlines? You have direct access that others don't. I guess this might be coming from an entrepreneur who's looking to provide blockchain solutions, I suppose.
Yeah. I don't think, I think in aviation with, information sharing already as it is between airports and airlines is horrendous. It's just not easy. And if there's any way of getting a competitive edge from the information you gather and you're basically administrating the whole network, it's not going to be a successful recipe. And this is why, ideally, beyond the life of the pilot, it would make a lot more sense to essentially transition this to government, where essentially they're neutral, they don't have any competitive desires to compete from one airport or the other, and they're really more of just an advocate for technology and to just help move things along in that regard.